You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Ethnocynology. I'm your host, David Ian Howe. I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist. And in a previous video of mine, one that went relatively viral for my channel, titled Why a Clovis Bone Needle is the Most Important Artifact in North America, we discussed with two researchers, Dr. Spencer Pelton and now Dr. McKenna Litynski, why a bone needle, an object so tiny and minuscule in the archaeological record, is actually one of the most important inventions of humankind. And why that's so important relative to other artifacts like stone tools or pottery or writing is that the bone needle allowed humans and Homo sapiens, modern humans ourselves, to traverse different landscapes and a much wider range across the world than we previously could before. Because earlier, humans were kind of, especially Neanderthals and earlier Homo erectus, were kind of relegated to caves. They couldn't really go too far out onto the plains of, say, Siberia. But with a bone needle, this is one that was used to hand poke a tattoo on my arm, but imagine one that was smaller, one like this in this picture, where it's eyed and used for sewing. That object can be used to sew and fine tailor hides that help keep that microclimate on your body. It is January here in Wyoming. It is currently 10 degrees outside. Why I'm dressed like this, but more appropriately for the video. However, clothes are what keep us alive. Yes, food does. Yes, hunting does. Yes, collecting those calories from hunting does keep you warm, but you have to maintain that heat to maintain those calories in your body so they don't just shiver away. While Dr. Pelton in that video talked more about hominid thermoregulation, his research doing ethnographic work in Mongolia, and then comparing that to Paleo-Americans or Paleo-Indians here on the American Plains and Rockies, how they maintain their heat. And at the time in that video, we talked with McKenna Litynski, who was just a PhD candidate at the University of Wyoming, but as of filming this video, she is now Dr. McKenna Litynski. However, what Dr. Litynski discussed in that previous video was using proteomics analysis of something called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, which is essentially when you find a bone needle like this at a site and it's shattered and fragmented, you don't have any diagnostic signatures on the bone to say this is, that's definitely a bird femur, or that's definitely a bison mandible. You don't have that when it's just shattered, weathered over 10,000 years. So what she can do is break down that bone and get the collagen out of it, and then put that sample into a machine called a mass spectrometer, which then can compare the molecular mass of those bones to other animals that are in the database and give us a relative idea for, okay, this is rabbit, or this is fox versus bison, or versus bear. It can't really differentiate between dog or wolf. It can't really differentiate between different species of bison, but it can tell you that this is a bison relative to a mammoth, or in the case of Leprel, foxes versus bison, which is really important to know. So consider this video the sequel, or if not the spiritual successor to the bone needle video. And what we're going to do is talk about Dr. Litynski's research on thermoregulation, bone needles, zooarchaeology, and human-animal relations in the Ice Age. And as we do that, if you've ever wondered how you get a PhD, how you go from a master's student or an undergrad to a PhD candidate to a PhD and then professor, we're going to lay that out as we go. So it's just kind of the process. I've known McKenna since she was starting her PhD, and I was there at her defense just recently when she earned her doctorate. So I can take you through the whole process of how that works, and I promise you it'll be simple as we go along. So let's talk to Dr. McKenna Litynski about clothing, archaeology, and zooarchaeology in the archaeological record, and what a world would look like without clothing.
My name is McKenna Litynski, and I'm an interdisciplinary archaeologist here at the University of Wyoming.
McKenna, what is a dissertation?
So I wrote a dissertation as part of my PhD journey, and what that typically involves is two different directions. The first direction involves writing a book, so your whole dissertation involves chapters of a book format. Or you can go the alternative direction of writing 3 separate manuscripts that are tied together by an introduction and conclusion. And it all has kind of a common theme behind it. And I chose the latter because I thought it would be most beneficial to me in the moment.
As we just talked about, you can either write a book, a long dissertation, or you can write 3 separate articles. And I asked McKenna here, what is the benefit of doing 3 articles versus a book? It seems like a book would be something you could just take and immediately go publish.
I think the benefit of doing the 3 manuscripts is that as you're going up for tenure, say if I got an academic job, I could slowly release some of these publications in different academic journals, which could ultimately help me achieve my tenure packet. Now, that depends on if I get a professorship opportunity in the future, but that's what I was thinking in the moment.
Are all of those articles separate research projects entirely, or do they all tie together?
Yeah, all three of the manuscripts tie together in some sort of common theme way. So it can be about clothing, it can be about lithics, but it all has to revolve around some common denominator.
When I got my master's, I had to have a committee. Do you have to have a committee for a PhD defense? And can you explain what that is?
As part of the PhD, and as you're writing your dissertation, you have to have 5 different committee members as a PhD student. 3 of those are within your field. You also have to have kind of in your realm, but outside of your direct field of study. And then you have to have someone completely unrelated to anthropology. And in my case, I had a chemist.
For those of you who are unfamiliar, in the United States, at least, maybe you do it overseas as well, you have to do what's called a defense, either for your master's or your doctorate. I had to do a defense for my master's. By the time I got to my defense, I had already given this presentation and presented my research enough that it wasn't too nerve-wracking, but it's still a nerve-wracking process. So I asked McKenna, can you explain in your words what a defense is?
So after you've written your entire dissertation, you then go up for your defense, which involves a big public presentation where people are celebrating your success. You get to share all of the work that you've been doing over the last couple years. And then afterwards, after you've answered the public's questions and everything, you then move forward to the private portion of the defense where it's just you and your committee members, and they're asking you questions about why you did what you did during your dissertation. From there, you walk out of the room, and hopefully they'll extend their hand and say, "Congratulations, doctor." So essentially, it's like earning your black belt in anthropology, which I think is kind of fun.
2 things. One, McKenna and I both got our degrees at the University of Wyoming Department of Anthropology. She got her PhD. I just got my master's. But Wyoming is a renowned school nationwide for archaeology. And one reason why is Wyoming's very unpopulated. It's one of the least populated states, if not the least populated state. I think there's more cows than people in Wyoming, which might be a true fact. I'll plop that here. But with that, there's a lot of undeveloped land, a lot of huge swaths of public, federal, Forest Service, state land that are untouched by development. So with that, you're able to see a lot more sites that haven't been disturbed, which is why Wyoming becomes such a great school for archaeology and geology as well as paleontology. And another thing, too, is Wyoming's anthropology department is a 4-field anthropology department. So it's a very well-rounded anthropological degree that you get, and I have McKenna elaborate on that here.
So the University of Wyoming is a very 4-field holistic department, meaning we're not just concentrating on archaeology, but we're also understanding the cultural, biological, and linguistic aspects of humanity. So I wouldn't consider myself to be just an archaeologist. I consider myself to be an anthropologist as a whole. And before you actually defend, you have to go through a grueling process called your preliminary exams. It's basically where you have 2 weeks to write 50 pages, answering 5 different questions proposed by your committee members. And they can be anything related to anthropology. For example, in my case, I was told that I had to produce a bone needle and construct what was in the mystery bag. And it was rabbit hide and artificial sinew. And then I was told to write about it. So it can be kind of out there and fun questions, but ultimately it's to help you arrive at a particular goal as you're going about your journey.
So with all that set up about what a dissertation is, let's finally get into McKenna's research, her work, and what got her her doctorate. McKenna, what was your dissertation?
My dissertation starts out with this statement: take a seat, close your eyes, and now imagine a world in which clothing never existed. Now, this is important because clothing varies in terms of complexity. It can consist of a simple draped, loosely fitted garment over the body, or it can be more complex with multiple layers of fitted clothing that are tightly woven to the body. And it's really the latter, this multi-layered fitted approach to clothing, that dramatically improved our ability to keep warm. In fact, so much so that it allowed early human populations to expand across the world during a really cold period in history known as the Late Pleistocene. But without the sewing needle, and supplemented with the sewing awl, clothing may have never achieved the warmth capacity that enabled us to expand across the world during this really cold period in history. And so it's really the sewing toolkit that changed the trajectory of humankind as we know it. I think it's great because we wear clothing all the time. When we put our jacket on and when we put our sweater on during the winter, it's really fun to reflect on how it really changed our lives as a whole.
As we discussed, McKenna did the 3-article route for her dissertation instead of the huge monograph. So let's just go into it right now. McKenna, what was Article 1 of your dissertation?
The first main manuscript of my dissertation focuses on what needles and awls are used for. Are they only used for these thermal activities, or could they be used for something else? And it also revolves around this question of where are these tools being used? Are they constrained to cold environments, or are they also used in these warmer regions? This chapter of my dissertation revolves around 2 different models. The first is what's called the thermoregulation model, which makes 2 basic empirically testable predictions for the ethnographic record. Now, it's really important here because I am an interdisciplinary archaeologist, I am a 4-field archaeologist, and so I really wanted to tie in this cultural and ethnographic component into my dissertation. So this model asks, okay, what are these things used for? And it hypothesizes that these tools are constrained to these practical, functional, thermal activities. Things like blankets, shelter, the construction and maintenance of clothing, the creation of footwear, and other items that are going to keep you warm. It also proposes that these tools are going to be constrained to colder geographical regions. But all of this said, on the other hand, we have this alternative model where these tools can be used for lots of other things, primarily related to the symbolic and cultural importance of these items in the past. It can be used for things like tattooing, basketry, woodworking, and so much more. And so in this light, perhaps these alternative functions are overwhelming any sort of climatic effects, and therefore these tools are not necessarily constrained to only the cold regions.
Okay, so what was the setup? What are the methods and materials for this?
How did I do this? Well, I looked at almost 2,000 different mentions of needles and awls in the ethnographic database known as the Electronic Human Relation Area Files World Cultures Database. What I really wanted to understand is not only what these tools are used for, but what is the extent to which these tools are used for strictly thermoregulation versus these alternative cultural functions. I also tied in the locations of these 59 different indigenous groups across North America in which I was looking at to see what is the temperature correlation. And in this case, I was looking specifically at the minimum temperature of the coldest month for each of these different geographical regions.
Awesome. So then what are the results? What did you find?
I found that in many cases, these tools are indeed used for the manufacture and maintenance of clothing, which is pretty predictable. We know that these tools are used for the manufacture of clothing. But what was surprising is that these tools are used in lots of other ways, and sometimes surprising ways. Things like medical suturing, ceremonies, storytelling, basketry, and the list goes on. Just the artistic expression of these tools is phenomenal. And we also found that, for the most part, these tools are indeed more correlated with these colder geographical regions as opposed to the warm ones, which is kind of what we predicted in that thermoregulation model. So using the ethnographic record as this proxy for interpreting the archaeological record then, we might assume that needles and awls, when they're pulled out of the ground from thousands of years ago, that they were likely correlated with colder geographical regions. But we can't say for certain that these tools are only used for the manufacture of clothing. Yes, they were likely used for that, but we also have to understand the multifaceted nature of these tools and just how important they are in every aspect of society. So, for example, if there's an eye in the sewing needle, if it's a particular dimension, perhaps you can assume that it was used for the manufacture of clothing, perhaps beadwork, or something along those lines. But if the needle is eyeless, if it has alternative dimensions, then perhaps we can assume it was used for tattooing or other cultural functions.
So that was Article 1. You had the research question, the methods, materials, and then the results. Now, McKenna, can you summarize all that? Just summarize Article 1 for the audience listening.
So what did we learn from Manuscript 1? We learned that these tools are more correlated with the colder geographical regions, and we learned that for the most part, these tools are used predominantly for clothing manufacture, but we can't ignore all of these other ways that the tools can be used.
Now, let's move on to Article 2.
The second manuscript of my dissertation really asks the question of why did people select certain animals over others for the manufacture of needles and awls out of bone in the past? And I do this by investigating various models and hypotheses and then pursuing a pretty special technique.
Great. McKenna, now can you lay out those models for the audience listening?
This manuscript of my dissertation revolves around 3 different models. The first model is what we call the opportunistic model, meaning people are going to take bones that are readily available to them on the landscape to reduce the amount of time that it takes to search for them. For example, in Wyoming, the archaeozoological record is dominated by bison and pronghorn. And so if people were taking these bones that were readily available to them, then perhaps we would see these tools are dominated by bison and pronghorn. The second model is what we call the bone suitability model. This means that people are going to either reduce the amount of time that it takes to craft these tools by selecting certain bones that more closely mimic the size and shape of these tools, or perhaps these bones are expanding the use life of these tools, meaning mechanical suitability might play a role in animal choice. The final model revolves around animal symbolism and the cultural aspects of animals in different societies, meaning perhaps people are going to avoid all of these other preconceived notions and just go after those animals that magnify the cultural and symbolic dimensions of their life.
So that's quite a big research question. How exactly did you tackle this? Like, what were your methods, materials?
So how did I answer each of these models? Well, I looked at animal choice across 111 awls and 37 different bone needles across 20 different archaeological sites representing diverse time periods in Wyoming. And specifically, I used a very special technique known as zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, or ZOOMS. What is ZOOMS, you might ask? Well, it simply involves extracting a little bit of collagen from each of these tools, running that through different chemical procedures and a very fancy instrument known as a mass spectrometer, and that results in a series of peaks on a screen. It's basically a barcode for species identification at that point.
So what did you find?
So after all of this chemistry, what did I find? Well, I found, for the most part, these tools are indeed reflecting the subsistence of people in Wyoming, meaning that these tools are reflective of bison, pronghorn, and mule deer. But we also see some preferential selection of certain animals over others. For example, we see more needles manufactured from small animals like jackrabbits, and we actually see a dominance of awls manufactured from things like pronghorn and deer, as opposed to the massive bison on the landscape. And this was to reduce the amount of time that it took to manufacture these tools. Surprisingly, bone mechanics doesn't play as essential of a role when it comes to why people were selecting certain animals over others for these tools' manufacture. For example, bison has a great bone structure. It would provide a very suitable tool in terms of durability, but people are actually selecting these medium-sized artiodactyls as opposed to the bison sometimes. We also see some really surprising findings where the cultural and symbolic attributes of the tools are reflected in these tools. For example, we see bone needles constructed from carnivores at a 13,000-year-old mammoth kill and campsite, and at another early site, we see an awl manufactured from a sandhill crane leg. And so it's just really fascinating to see people's agency and choices reflected in these tools.
That was Article 2. For the audience listening and for myself, McKenna, can you summarize everything that just happened in Article 2?
So Manuscript 2 really showcases how people are selective, they have agency, and they have choice when it comes to manufacturing these really important sewing technologies. It showcases this through a very special technique, a very rare one, that involves very interdisciplinary methodologies and approaches. So I think it's a very holistic paper, and hopefully other people enjoy it too.
You mentioned to me that you worked with mechanical engineers. Did you specifically test like the mechanical structure of those bones or something?
Actually, that is exactly what my third manuscript is about.
Great. So let's move on to Article 3.
So I really wanted to understand, are there notable differences in the strength and flexibility attributes of bones from different animals, and particularly when it comes to the sewing action? This is where I really dove into the literature and I found some interesting findings. First, I found that there's a type of bone structure called plexiform bone. This is more common among animals that grow really fast and tall early on in life. So things like elk, moose, bison, and other animals along those lines. We also have a different form of bone structure, which is called a haversian system. And this is basically mature bone that replaces that more juvenile bone. This is more common among leporids, which are jackrabbits, felids, which are cats, canids, which are dogs, and procyonids, which are things like raccoons. This is important because plexiform bone structure is actually more suitable when it comes to strength and flexibility under flexion forces. Meaning, if this is the bone, it's bending in flexion like this. So given this information, we might expect certain bone needles to last longer when it comes to the act of sewing versus others.
How did you test that?
So how did I test this? Well, first I had to collect lots of different animal bones across various taxa. In terms of the mechanical engineering tests, I evaluated cervids, so specifically elk and moose, bovids, which include bighorn sheep and cattle. I also examined pronghorn, which are antilocaprids. Additionally, I looked at a few different carnivores, so things like bear and coyote. And then finally, I tested a few different types of birds, specifically turkey and Canadian geese. This was a very stinky process because this involves removing all of that yucky marrow and periosteum and flesh off of the bones so that they're bright, white, and clean. From there, I manufactured rectangular bone blanks, so rectangular slivers of bone. And then I worked with mechanical engineers to run them through flexion tests, where the length, width, and other dimensions of the bone blanks was standardized, and the only variables being tested was how much force is required to break these bones.
I remember in your defense, you showed a slow-mo video of a bone needle being tested and it broke. Can you talk about that?
So you can see in this video here that the bone is supported by two different prongs on the bottom, and then there's a prong at the top that is slowly pushing down on the bone. It's applying force in small increments, and then upon enough application of force, that bone snaps in half. And the amount of force and how flexible that bone is all recorded on a computer, to which then I could compare animal to animal. So after I ran all of these different tests, I recorded the maximum strength, the maximum flexibility, and what we call optimal toughness of these different bones. What toughness is basically this balance between strength and flexibility to see which needles can be used for longer periods of time versus others, depending on the animal selected.
So what were the results for Article 3 then?
So what did I find after all of these different tests? Well, I found that for the most part, elk and moose are the strongest and toughest bones out of all of the different animals considered. Other bovids like cattle, bighorn sheep, and some pronghorn are also relatively strong and tough, but not quite to the extent of the elk and the moose, which are superior. But when it comes to carnivores and birds, strength plummets. So when it comes to the bear and coyote, it does not have the strength attributes that would lend to an optimal sewing needle if you're worried about when it might break. Additionally, things like turkey, terrible. Never make a bone needle out of turkey, according to this study. So, all of this being said, we have these really meaningful differences in the strength and flexibility attributes of these different animals. And this is really important when it comes to sewing needles and whether or not they're likely to break.
Awesome. So for the audience and for myself, McKenna, can you summarize Article 3 and everything you just said?
So I talked about this experimental setting, but does this mean anything when it comes to the archaeological record? Well, all we have to do is factor in strength, flexibility, and other attributes into our equations to come to some sort of sense as to how likely a bone needle in the archaeological record is to break, depending on animal choice. So, for example, the typical bone needle is twice as likely to break if it's manufactured from something like a coyote as opposed to an elk or a moose, which is pretty significant when it comes to people's livelihoods in the past.
I've noticed with a lot of students, and myself included in that, when you are so bogged down in doing all of this research and conducting, some of what would be considered your life's work, it's sometimes easy to get lost in all the data and all the testing and what you found and the results and all that. However, as I mentioned before, Wyoming is a four-field kind of well-rounded anthropological program. We're not just archaeologists, we're anthropologists. So I asked McKenna here, why does this matter to anthropology? Like, where does this fit in the big picture?
This is really important because we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about when we need clothes, because we're cold, we need them now. And so if a bone needle breaks, that means that we're going to have to make that entire bone needle again, meaning children might freeze. You never know. And so understanding which animals are more likely to break when it comes to the action of sewing, depending on which animal it's made out of, is really important when it comes to understanding not only thermoregulation, not only clothing manufacture at this point, but also people's ability to expand across the world. This is why archaeology is so fascinating, because at the end of the day, we're not hunting for these pretty, interesting artifacts. We want to understand people. We want to understand their daily lives, the people that use these objects in the past, to understand their culture, their symbolism, and their actions moving across the landscape. So I think anthropology, archaeology as a whole is just so fascinating.
You just did a lot of work. I saw you start as a PhD student, and I saw your defense, which you did with flying colors. It was excellent. What is next for you now after this huge pile of work is behind you?
So yeah, after I finished writing the entire dissertation, I went up for my defense. There were so many different people in the room. I had so much support from my friends, faculty members, etc. I gave about a 50-minute presentation on my work. I pretty much considered it a celebration of all that I've accomplished over the years. It was like a little package with a really nice bow. Got lots of different questions and comments from the public, and then I got some really great feedback from my committee members. Then I walked out of the room, and sure enough, one of the committee members extended their hand and said, "Congratulations, Dr. Litynski." So I am now a Doctor of Philosophy in Anthropology.
You might be wondering, how long does something like this take? Some people can get their PhDs done in like 4 years. Other people take 8. Some people take a long time. And then you get kicked out of the department, not just Wyoming, but other departments too, if you take too long. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of stress. It's a lot of work. And it takes a long time. So I asked McKenna, like, how long did this take you?
To finish up my PhD journey, it took me 3 years. That's really quick. Most people take 5 to 7 years to complete their PhD. But man, am I determined, and I'm ambitious, so I got it done.
Follow-up question to that. Why do that to yourself?
Why would I do that to myself? Good question, and you can ask future me about that later.
I stated this earlier too, but it's easy to get bogged down in your research and all the setup, the grants, the funding, the defending, the research, the collaborating, the emails, just pouring into it and then having to make a presentation and defend it and all the mental health struggle that goes into that. But it's easy to forget. We're here to learn. We're here to ask questions and learn things. And during your defense, the audience is allowed to ask questions as well as the professors and that are on the committee. So the question I asked McKenna in her dissertation was, like, with all that said, what was your favorite thing you learned?
One of the things in my dissertation that really surprised me and got me a little giddy was the fact that bone needles are used for medical suturing. So in the ethnographic record, one of my favorite instances is kind of up in the Arctic Circle. We see people sitting down, and there's a doctor in their society kind of stitching their feet back together with this bone needle because they've cut them on rocks and they're cold because of the snow. And the person is just sitting there smiling as this is being done, because showing any sign of, hurt is considered a weakness. And so I was like, man, this is crazy. I also noticed that in those societies up near the Arctic Circle, they use the bone needles for snow blindness. We also see awls and needles used for boils and other sorts of medical ailments. So Yeah, just crazy stuff.
Now, as Laprelle, the site that we talked about in the Bone Needle video, which is one of the oldest sites in Wyoming, if not the oldest, it's a mammoth kill and campsite where they're processing mammoth, bison, red ochre, all sorts of things there. It was a major part of McKenna's dissertation. Bringing it back to that, McKenna, what did this dissertation bring up about Laprelle that was really interesting?
I also found it really interesting that Laprelle reflects the only instance where we see bone needles manufactured from carnivores. So I was really trying to understand why people manufactured them from carnivores as opposed to other more common animals on the landscape. Some believe this could be strictly thermoregulation, meaning they're just going after the fox because it has really warm pelts, meaning it offers really warm clothing for people living in these cold regions. I would also like to ponder the sort of synanthropic relations between these carnivores and the human, meaning the fox is taking advantage of some of the human's food, and the human is also taking advantage of the fox in terms of producing needles from its bones and producing clothing from its pelt. And so it's a bit like this symbiotic relationship similar to humans and dogs today, but in this case, we're looking at fox.
In your defense, you mentioned something about the crane awl. Can you elaborate on that?
The crane awl is also fascinating to me. We know that Wyoming is a breeding ground for sandhill cranes, but where this awl was found is pretty far from those sandhill crane breeding grounds. So in this light, we know that this tool is highly curated, meaning people made this tool or procured its bone somewhere else on the landscape, and then it was brought to this site in the past. So it kind of traveled across the landscape because of this human specifically wanting the tool to be made out of a crane.
So a dissertation is a lot. It's mentally taxing. It is mentally taxing. It is financially taxing. It is a lot of things. You shouldn't get your PhD unless you're getting funding to do so. That's my advice to you. But with that said, McKenna, what is your advice to future students that might want to get their PhD in anthropology or anything?
I would say the dedication page of my dissertation says something like this. It says, to future students, chase your dreams because those dreams can become a reality. So with a little dash of passion, a little bit of ambition, you can do what you think you can do. And so I think that's what I would say to future students is, grad school's hard. You're going to have your ups and downs, but if you can just kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, if you can find little things every day that excite you and you really think about why you're doing what you're doing, I think you can go a really long ways.
I can tell you firsthand, McKenna is one of the most driven and almost to a fault works too hard. We'd have to be like, hey, live a little, So on the outside of school, McKenna, what are some things that you do to, pass the time that isn't just slamming your head on the table writing, your doctorate?
And I do things outside of academia. I do country swing dancing, I fish, I hike, I play lots of board games with my friends and family sometimes. So lots of different outlets to kind of keep myself motivated.
You did a lot of field work for your dissertation. Can you elaborate to the audience on that? What would be your advice for field work?
I would also say to future students that grab any sort of fieldwork opportunities that you can. I've worked at lots of different sites in Wyoming. I've had lots of fun along the way, and I've learned so much. In fact, that's how I met you, David. It was at Laprelle that I met you about 4 years ago now. So yeah, just opportunities galore, and I hope you take advantage of them.
So now you're a doctor. Congrats. What's next for you?
Right now I'm on the job market and I'm in search for anything that's going to suit my ideal interests. So I've applied for postdocs, professorships, research scientist positions, and museum positions. But ultimately, I would love to study human-environmental interactions. I'm really interested in people's relationship with their environment, how they build their environments and respond to them. And I'm also really interested in people and animals as a whole, and the intrinsic bonds that they develop, how they move across the landscape together and in tandem, and other aspects of those realms.
For any potential employers that are watching this video, what would be your ideal position, or what would be your ideal career path that you'd like to go down?
My ideal position would be a professor. I absolutely love research, as you can tell by this video, but I also love teaching. I love inspiring students. In fact, just last semester, I was the sole instructor for Introduction to Archaeology. I had 120 students, and it was such a wonderful opportunity just to see their little eyes light up in the seats and understand archaeological concepts, anthropology as a whole, and yeah, just to make a difference in lives.
Well, thanks for coming on. Anything else, McKenna?
My name is Dr. McKenna Litynski, and if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the section below. Thanks for watching.
So that video not only was McKenna's dissertation and her life's work that earned her a PhD in anthropology, but it also was the process of how one gets a PhD in anthropology, what that's like. Kind of superficially, we could go way more into it. If you have questions about the nitty-gritty of that, please put them in the comments, because I have tons of friends that have their PhDs that will answer you very honestly about what the system and what the process is like. But yeah, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or maybe some of that was a little confusing or you got lost at some point, put it in the comments. I'll try to answer it. McKenna might try to answer it as well. If you have any questions about archaeology, thermoregulation, bone needles, zooarchaeology, or zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, the proteomics analysis she did, please put any questions or comments down in the comments. And if you're looking to get your PhD in anthropology yourself, please let us know. Put that down here in the comments. Or anything else you want to say. If you want me to get my PhD and get my ass in gear and finally do it, please comment that. But above all, please, if you want, and if you can, please comment congratulations to Dr. Litynski, because this was a lot of work. I watched her go from, day one to her defense. I'm incredibly proud of her. It's very hard work, and anyone who has earned a PhD in anthropology, my hat goes off to you. I didn't physically take it off, but my hat goes off to you for doing so, because it is a lot of grueling and challenging work. And I respect the hell out of you. So please remember, you can go to my website, davidianhowe.com or davidianhowe.com/store to get any hats, hoodies, merch, prints, the Ettore prints that he makes. Those sell really well. People order them like almost every week. So please, if you'd like some, please go do that. And also my hat here, the Ethnocynology beanie. I believe it's called Beanie for Fire Building Apes on my website. If you want one, they're right there on the website. Please click the link. Get it. It's a quick and easy thing. It ships right to your house. So thank you very much. Also, lastly, please remember to rate and review the podcast. My podcast is hosted the video form on YouTube, but the audio version is hosted on the Archaeology Podcast Network, which has a multitude of shows, a huge backlog of other archaeology shows. So if you're sick of hearing comedy, you're sick of hearing about Venezuela or Iran or anything like that, please go back into the backlog of the Archaeology Podcast Network and listen to some information about archaeology and enjoy yourself while you do it. Thank you very much. My name's David Howe, and that is it.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.